Oh, no fun fact.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't have one. Michelle's going to tell us.
Yeah,
In fact, why
let's
don't you
see.
just sing or play an instrument for us? Because clearly that is it.
No fun fact. So I didn't. I haven't cracked any defense secretary's passwords, but I did once spend 3 years negotiating to get access to the actual passwords of everybody at Carnegie Mellon University so that we could analyze them. And it turns out that you can do that if you jump through a certain number of hoops. Not anymore, because after we figured out that we could do that, they fixed it so nobody can do that anymore. But before they fixed it, we used it for research, so it was fun. Okay. So thanks, everybody. Really delighted to be here. This is going to be fun because oftentimes when I give this talk or some version of this talk, I feel like I'm trying to kind of hit people over the head with things, and I feel like for a change, maybe I'm in a room of people who are not going to want to argue with me too hard about too many of these things, although argue about some of them. So this should be fun. So I'm going to start out by trying to argue that what people know and understand about security and privacy matters. And after all these great talks we've had all day, hopefully you don't even need me to tell you this anymore. Hopefully you already think so. But just in case, all kinds of people. So we have end users, right, which here's an example of an employee from a hospital who got phished and resulted in sort of ransomware that messed up the entire hospital system for several weeks. This is a few years old, but there are many such incidents that happen all the time, right? But not just end users. Also, not just in general, but lots of very specific kinds of people. Lawyers, real estate agents, who it turns out get targeted because they handle big money transfers all the time. Journalists. Here's a favorite example of mine. So I paraphrase this to make it hard to just go back to Twitter and type it in and find the person because I'm not trying to pick on this person. But this is a journalist who is asking for information on any abortions that might have been paid for by certain politicians, which is one thing. But then it says DM for Signal. And actually, this is not the only time I've seen this. I've seen various versions of this, right? And if the idea is that you are trying to blow the whistle on somebody and you want to do it secretly using Signal, sending somebody a DM, which is not encrypted, which says, "Hi, journalist, I would like to talk to you about this secret that I would like to tell you about," is not going to be good OPSEC for you, right? And the journalist, in this case, should sort of know better than to tell random whistleblowers to DM them for their Signal information, right? But here we are. How about some other people who ought to be experts? So software engineers maybe are supposed to know things, and indeed they do know a lot of things about that they need for their jobs, but this is one of my favorite papers from the last few years. This came out at SOUPS. This was based on an ethnographic study of a student who embedded themselves in not just any software company, but a software security company that builds security products. And the student, while he was there, found some cross-site scripting vulnerabilities in their product. And one of we reported this to his manager, the team that he was working with, and the software engineer said, "No, that's not possible because we're using Angular, and it's not possible to have cross-site scripting attacks in Angular. So this can't possibly be right, right?" So, this is things, even people who maybe should know better, or who we think sometimes might know better. So, what people know about security and privacy matters. But wouldn't it be nice maybe if it didn't? So maybe we don't have to worry about this much longer, right? Because maybe AI is just coming to save us and all of these problems are going to go away, right? So maybe not. Here's another of my favorites from a couple of years ago. This is a study of people using Copilot to write code, and they found that 40% of the people writing code in this little tiny play study who used Copilot ended up generating insecure code because Copilot made insecure suggestions to them for the code that they were writing. And there are, I could just spend this entire rest of this talk talking about all the ways in which AI is actually not going to save us from these things, but I'll skip that and we'll sort of take that as read. Okay, so maybe not. So unfortunately, though, a lot of what people know about security and privacy is wrong, is unhelpful, or in some cases just kind of plain weird. So where do people get all this information from? So it turns out maybe not all the places you would expect, although some of them, were brought up earlier today. So one place where people get a lot of information from is fictional media. So we wrote a paper about this a few years back, talking to people about sort of what they had learned about cybersecurity from watching TV and watching movies, right? And here's some of the things that they learned. They learned that attackers only target specific high-value individuals, right? So if you're just like a regular guy who goes to your regular office job, cybersecurity is not for you, right? It's only for like the people who know the, big expensive national secrets, right? And I don't even mean like the, everybody in the building has a clearance secrets, right? I mean the big national secrets. Also, attacks in unsafe situations are obvious, right? Because anytime when you receive a cyber attack, something like that will happen. Right? This is what happens. Your screen will flash red. There will be like big blinking things at you that will say like, you are under attack, right? So this is what we learned. We also learned that attacks are inevitable and security measures are actually futile. So the message people take from this is that like, no matter how good your security is, if there's a teenager with hair that's been dyed pink, they will be able to crack your stuff in 15 minutes or less, right? That's what we've all learned from TV. So there's actually sort of no point in trying to protect yourself because nothing can be done to prevent any of these things to begin with. Another maybe unexpected place where people are getting some cybersecurity advice is from YouTube influencers, and maybe not in the way that you think. This is a study we did a couple of years ago based on one of my students who came to see me and who was like, have you seen all these ads for VPNs on YouTube? And so what we actually did was we did a study where we sort of looked at a random sample of about 1.5% of all of YouTube to find out what these things say. And these are not like the ads that YouTube serves you that sort of interrupt your video in between. These are the things where the influencers have sponsored content, right? So I'm too old for a lot of this, and probably like many of you are too, but maybe like your kids or your relatives or something do this, right? The influencer says like, thank you for watching my video. It's sponsored by NordVPN today, right? And it turns out that these things are full of overclaims and overpromises. So if you listen to these influencers who are trying to get you to sort of go buy NordVPN with their discount code so that they can get a commission back, they're going to tell you that using a VPN can protect your credit card data once it's been stored at the server of the e-commerce shop that you're planning on buying things at. That's not how it works. We actually have one video in which the influencer says, get this VPN software and you will never have to worry about anything on the internet ever again, which is amazing. Can I sign up for that? No. They also tell you a lot. One of my personal favorite hobby horses, which is going to come up like multiple more times in this talk, they tell you constantly to be afraid of public Wi-Fi. This is why you need to get a VPN, right? Because if you go to Starbucks and you use their Wi-Fi, terrible things will happen to you, so you need to pay for the VPN to stop this from happening. Another place where people sort of get this information, which has come up a fair bit already today, is from corporate training, which, unfortunately kind of varies in what the content says. So here are some things that were in the corporate training that I received from the University of Maryland last year. So this was in, I guess, February of 2023. Always change the default password that came with your router. So this is really excellent advice for like 2008, right? I haven't had a router that came with like a crappy default password in a really long time. I don't know about the rest of you. This is just sort of not that high on my list. They also told me that when I make a password, I should substitute 3 for E and R for R. In 2023, guys, this is really sad. And finally, they told me to choose a passphrase by choosing a line from my favorite song. And I did a lot of work on passwords and password creation strategies when I was a grad student. Let me tell you, this does not work. Don't do that. And of course, again, my very favorite, always be afraid of public Wi-Fi. Okay, so actually, after I took that training last year, I yelled at our CTO a little bit, and they did fix some of it for this year. So most of the things on the previous slide are gone now, but this is still there. So just be terrified of public Wi-Fi all the time, right? Okay, another place where people get their information is from Stack Overflow. So if you're not like a software developer person, you may not be super familiar, but this is a website that people use to solve their programming problems. My code doesn't work. What do? I type it into Google and Stack Overflow pops up and tells me how to fix it. This is like really great, except of course for when it's terrible. And so this is a study, this one's getting a little old now, but I think the main point is still kind of true. They looked at Android apps because it's easy to sort of download the source code for a lot of Android apps. And they found that looking at Stack Overflow, 30% of the code snippets that were published on Stack Overflow relating to Android were insecure. And they found that 15% of all the Android apps they looked at contained at least one snippet of code that appeared to have been copied directly from Stack Overflow. And 15% had at least one insecure snippet that came from Stack Overflow. And what makes this worse is that a lot of these actually, people put up these like code snippets to try to help somebody solve a problem, and they'll actually put a little warning on it, and it'll say like, hey, this is not, this is like a quick solution, but it's not secure, or somebody else will reply to the solution and say, don't do this is insecure. Turns out putting a warning on this thing, functionally no correlation with whether or not people will reuse it. Look, it's example code, it's sitting there, it works, of course I'm gonna reuse it. And then, compliance standards are another place. So Josiah actually was a co-author on this paper where we went through a bunch of these compliance standards that people have to meet in security and found a lot of problems with them. So a lot of these standards are entrenching outdated requirements. So for example, telling everybody to change their password frequently. Some of them are even entrenching specific old technologies. So the thing that was the hottest new technology at the time when the standard was published, but is sort of no longer true a few years later. A lot of them also have sort of vague instructions, which say things like, have an access control policy, which, true, but maybe sort of insufficient by itself, right? And some of them have impossible requirements. So my favorite example for this was the standard that simultaneously, had things to say about like the number of 24-hour security guards that you need to keep at any building where you're processing sensitive data, but also later in the same standard had guidelines for telework. So how many people are keeping, 3 24-hour security guards like in their living room because they bring their laptop home for these things, right? So people are sort of learning from this stuff that security is kind of mechanistic and has all these rules and that they may not necessarily be true anymore. So sort of overall, some of my students and I sort of went to take a look at like what all the security advice on the web kind of looks like. And so we collected a big corpus of all the security advice we could find, and we sort of reduced it to imperatives. So like each document tells you some set of things that you're supposed to do or not supposed to do, and then we measured a bunch of stuff with it. So for the moment, let's think about reducing to imperatives. So what we found out was we found 476 unique web domains that contained some kind of security and privacy advice, which had a total of 2,780 imperatives across these 476 domains. But here's the scary part. When we group these things together, there were 374 unique imperatives. So I'm going to say that one more time. That's 374 individual things you are supposed to be doing or not doing in order to keep yourself safe. Here's an example. I'm going to pick on the FBI here for a minute, not because they're the only ones or necessarily the worst ones, but because why not? So here are some cyber safety tips from the FBI. So at first glance, this isn't too bad, right? So there's 8 tips here on this page, except it turned right 8 tips, but then it turns out a lot of them are actually more than one tip, right? So okay, so just kidding, 11 tips here on this page. Here we go again, public Wi-Fi. Change those passphrases regularly, right? And it turns out it's actually a little worse than this because this is sort of one page, but then they have another page. So that one is cyber safety tips, but this one says what you should know. And this one is just full of all of these links like this. And if you click on this link, learn how to protect your computer, it takes you to something that looks like that. And it just kind of keeps going, right? So you could literally spend all day doing nothing but sort of falling down a cybersecurity hole, clicking on these links in this FBI guidance, right? Okay, so how did we get here, right? How did we get to a place where we're telling people that there are 374 individual, sometimes directly contradictory things that they're supposed to be doing every day just to keep themselves safe on the internet? Well, the bad news is, it's kind of our fault. And by our fault, I mean like security experts or people who work in this field, right? Because we keep making some of the same mistakes that sort of lead to this problem. So here's a really cool study that was first conducted in 2015 and then was sort of replicated in 2019, comparing security experts to sort of non-expert lay people. And they found huge gaps in the top 3 most important protective behaviors. So the experts said the most important things to do are take your software updates, use your password manager, use two-factor authentication. The lay people said use antivirus software, pick strong passwords, and don't share private information on the internet, basically. And so there's this big gap here. And so this led us to kind of wonder, maybe the problem is just that there's too much advice out there, and sort of the experts know what the good stuff is, but they just haven't done a good enough job of kind of being loud enough about what are the things that people need to care about. So, maybe we just have to weed out the non-expert advice and get a little better at this. Well, we took that study of 374 imperatives and we showed them to a whole bunch of cybersecurity experts. So this is the part where we asked them, about the perceived efficacy of each one of those 374 imperatives. And unfortunately, it turns out that is about 97% of the imperatives which the experts, so each one was looked at by 3 to 5 experts, and either a majority or all of our experts agreed that the imperative was useless for something like 95% of the 374 imperatives that we looked at. This gets a little bit worse. Every single document we had from the web contained at least one imperative that was rated effective by a majority of the experts who looked at it. 82% of them contained only advice that was rated to be effective. We also asked the experts to pick their top 3 behaviors that they would recommend. And across the experts, 25 different behaviors were classified in somebody's top 3, and 118 behaviors were in somebody's top 5. So that's 31% of all of the things were in somebody's top 5 of behaviors to do. So how does this happen? Well, old recommendations never die, right? Change those default router passwords. Even though that again, it was not a wrong thing, it's just an old thing. There's also no prioritization happening here. We're just recommending everything that might possibly help all the time. And there's just kind of zero risk tolerance, right? So any sort of bad thing that might ever happen, we need to try to protect against. On some level that kind of makes sense, but it turns out in practice, it leads to a lot of problems. We also have sort of limited measures of practical effectiveness. So we talked about this a little earlier today as well, right? That we don't necessarily, one of the reasons why we have this chaos is we don't necessarily know which of these measures are really working and which ones are really not working. And that makes it hard to give people really good advice. So when I say that this is our fault, what do I mean? Well, I mean, we have this thing that we know and that we love and that we teach all of our students and our junior people called the security mindset. And the idea of the security mindset here is that we always want to look for the worst case scenario, right? Who here has heard this saying, like, the bad guy only, you have to be right 100% of the time and the bad guy only has to be right once, right? Everybody's heard that before. And that's not wrong, right? In some sense, this is our job. It's important, right? We want security experts to be doing these things, right? It's our job to think about the worst case scenario. It's, for vulnerability analysts to try to think of all the bad things that could possibly happen, to look at weird coincidences or notice strange things that go wrong and all these kinds of things. But if we just kind of apply this without thinking about it, we can create problems, right? It requires context when you want to apply the security mindset. If we just apply this security mindset in an unlimited way, it prevents prioritization, and it generates learned helplessness, right? If you give people too many things to do, people are not going to do anything, right? Telling them they have to do 300 things to protect themselves, that's just a recipe for people to give up and do none of those things. It also creates this idea that security is impossible, which, I just said earlier in our study of kind of what people learn from the media. They learn that security is impossible and there's nothing we can do to help, right? And on some level, this is not exactly wrong, right? If the NSA or the GRU decides that they would like to target you specifically for your information, and they're willing to throw, $10 or $50 million at the problem, you're probably toast, right? But for most people, that's not really the threat model that you should worry about, right? And if what we do is always talk about how impossible it is to secure anything, what we're really saying is that we shouldn't do anything. And I think that, nobody in this room probably thinks that's true, right? Like, Signal is not perfect, but it's a big improvement over SMS text messages, right? These things, and so saying, like, we're not going to do anything if we can't get everything totally right is unhelpful. So this is about the point in the talk where people start kind of giving me looks, right? And so they say things like, what about the worst case scenario, right? I've been up here harping on public Wi-Fi not being a big deal. And this is the point where somebody wants to raise their hand and say, what about TLS downgrade attacks? If you have no idea what I'm talking about, that's totally fine. What about, yes, 99% of websites use HTTPS now, but what about that one time when you visit a website which is not using HTTPS and you type in your password and it's transferred unencrypted, right? How can you tell people that public Wi-Fi is safe? And sure, all of these things can happen, right? Bad things can happen anywhere. I can walk out of here and get hit by a bus trying to go home to pick up my kid, right? Any of these things can happen, but we need to prioritize. And telling people to freak out about public Wi-Fi is just not at the top of the list. We should celebrate this. We actually did get 99% of the web to happen over HTTPS. This is a win. We should take this win and be happy about it instead of constantly telling people to be afraid of these things. And plus, this is an area where I think nobody practices what they preach, right? So if you came here on a plane, I guarantee that at some point between your house and getting here, you used a public Wi-Fi network, right? And so did, you probably used one the last time you decided you wanted to work from a coffee shop or something like that, right? So let's stop terrorizing people with things that don't matter so we can focus on the things that do. The next question people have is, what about the people in special circumstances? So, again, this is sort of generalized advice, right? If you are that person that the NSA wants to spend $50 million to target, this talk does not apply to you, okay? This is also true of certain people, certain journalists and activists in very high sensitivity positions, right? People experiencing intimate partner abuse. Those are people who need different kinds of advice. They need specialized advice. That is not what this talk is about. This talk is about advice for more general people. And what about the messaging we don't control, right? So we're probably not going to fix Hollywood, right? It's less exciting for the plot if the teenager with the pink hair can't crack the password, right? So we can't fix that, but there are a lot of things we kind of can fix. A lot of this other stuff, the corporate training, what's in compliance standards, some of the other things is kind of downstream from things that security experts say. And even the things that are in movies are to some extent also downstream, right? These people do some research, then they decide to throw some of it out because it's less exciting for the plot, but they do sort of, try to do sometimes more than others to be, some of them care about being realistic more than others do, but these are things that, we have some influence on. And am I really saying that we should be out here abandoning adversarial thinking and abandoning the security mindset? Of course not. This stuff is important, but again, we need to think about how and when to apply it and when not. When you're thinking about how do I defend my network, the adversarial mindset is a great thing to think about. When you're thinking about what am I going to tell my 10,000 employees about how to keep safe from phishing, the adversarial mindset may not be the best thing that you want. Okay, so now what? Here we are. We live in a world where there are 374 imperatives and where old security advice never dies. Well, what are we going to do about it? This is a hard problem to solve. I don't have any magic bullet solutions here, but one of the things that we need some more outreach. We need to be out here actively working to dispel wrong and outdated information. It's not enough to just kind of quietly disappear it from some of our trainings, although that would also help. But we do need to be out here explicitly telling people that the things they had to worry about 15 years ago are not the things that they have to worry about now. We also need to stop letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, especially when we talk to people, right? So, if you it's okay to know, you can know that nothing is perfect, but you can still give people advice that will help them, right? Like 2FA is not perfect, but it's a big improvement over not having 2FA, right? All of these things. And we need to prioritize. How can we expect our users to figure out what to do if we can't figure out what to do, right? So we need to figure out what we think is important, and that's what we need to tell people. We need to pick 3 things, maybe fewer than 3 things that sort of you can just tell all the people in your company, tell all the people in your organization, do these things, not do 370 things, not 2 hours of annual security training with giant lists of 10 and 15 things to do. And so some examples, I think Julie talked about this earlier, the updated NIST password guidelines. That should say 2017, I think. I'm going to fix that. But the updated password guidance brought in a whole lot of good information from a lot of research that a lot of, excellent academics and practitioners did to improve these password guidelines in a reality-based way. This stuff has become slow to kind of percolate into organizations, unfortunately. So when I showed up at UMD, one of the first things that I did was ask them why they were still making us rotate our passwords all the time when we know that that's not the best practice. And they told me, well, that's what the NIST guidance says, so we're going to keep doing it while the NIST guidance says it. So then I got the email that the new password guidance was published, and I jumped up and down, and I was like, yes, it's here. So I went to see my CTO again, and I said, look, we can stop now. But it turns out we still can't stop. I think this time it's because of some state law or something like that. But this is still what my inbox looks like on a fairly regular basis, right? I'm still required to rotate my passwords. So we're working on it. We're slowly making progress. We don't have to rotate them quite as often as we used to. But do you know people in your company who might believe you if you told them that the research says you don't have to rotate your passwords anymore? A lot of people in this room are government agencies, okay, but do you know some folks who disseminate this guidance, right? Having that NIST guidance, even though it's taking a little while to percolate, is still just spectacularly better than not having it. It's such a huge win to be able to point at this thing that that took something outdated and actually got rid of it, and explicitly, like it says in the guidelines, they didn't just vanish it. It says in the guidelines, we don't recommend doing this anymore. So we need more of this kind of thing. We also need more research. So some of the advice, we know is bad and outdated. Other stuff, it's a little hard to know. We don't really know what works and what doesn't work. And it's not really, necessarily as sexy in a research way to measure what advice works as it is to find a cool new vulnerability somewhere. But this would actually sort of be more useful. We need measurement studies for how often different kinds of attacks occur and how effective defenses are in practice, and not just in a lab setting, but in real life when real people use them, how effective are they? So we can figure out the expected value of these things and figure out which ones are useful. Here's a couple of recent examples. This is a paper from a couple of years ago about a large-scale measurement of cybercrime against individuals and a long-term, large-scale study about phishing. And what's fun about both of these papers is that they were really large, long-term measurements that overturned some kind of some assumptions that previously existed. I think in the slightly longer version of this talk, I have some quotes. So the first one basically found that all of the measurements of cybercrime that are reported out by Gartner and by people like that are drastically overstated. They're telling you there are $100 million of losses to cybersecurity and this many attacks on individuals, and it turns out these numbers are almost certainly inflated by hundreds or thousands of times. And this phishing study also found that a bunch of the kinds of like training and prevention measures that people have been sort of selling for many years weren't really very effective. We also need research on reducing the burden of this security and privacy. So, despite my jokes about AI earlier, we actually do need some more automation to reduce the burden on users wherever we can get it, when it works, which, it's not going to be perfect and it's not going to solve everything. And we need better defaults, and these are things that a lot of people are working on, and they do get better all the time. We need better interfaces. We need things like in-band education, right? So we shouldn't just rely on like annual trainings that people take once a year, but rather, how can we educate people in the moment or in the middle of doing the task that they're doing anyway? Can we teach them something while they're doing it so that it's not like a specific thing that you have to seek out? Especially, right, so people who don't work in corporate environments don't get annual security training, right? People who work in other kinds of jobs, they are only hearing this stuff from like the media or like, their cousin Bob who works in IT or something like that, right? So we really need ways to reach people while they're using the apps or the platforms that they're using. And all of this stuff is important, and there's a lot of work being done here, but it's sort of not enough all by itself. We need to find some other ways to reduce the burdens on individuals. So some possibilities here that I think are worth exploring are looking for trusted intermediaries. So looking for ways to reduce the decision-making burden on people by moving into people whose job it is. So we did a study a little while back looking at sort of product reviewers, right? So if I want to buy a washing machine, I don't actually need to know a whole lot about how washing machines work. I go to Consumer Reports and or I go to the Wirecutter and they tell me which washing machine to buy, and then that's what I do. I buy that washing machine, right? So when I'm looking at an IoT device or something, having labels is a great idea for people to look at, but also, can we just make it so that product reviewers have to can give people information about this? Like, is it enough can they just, so I don't have to look at the label and figure out what all of these things mean. Can somebody just tell me which washing machine to buy, and then I'll buy that one, right? So, and it turns out this is hard because the product reviewers aren't security and privacy experts either, so they don't know how to do this either. But this is sort of a way to, but this is a place where we could do some outreach, right? Like, if we can make this easier for the product reviewers, that can benefit a whole lot of people downstream. And that's just one example. There's other places where you could look for intermediaries who, we like to joke that sort of, end users, security is a secondary task, right? Nobody gets up in the morning to do security and privacy. Well, for some people that sort of is their job, or can we make it their job, right? A lot of us in this room. So can we move the burden to the people whose job it is rather than the people whose job it isn't? We also need to think more about personalizing advice. There are some interesting efforts going on in this direction. So like EFF has this thing called Security Planner, which it's like a little wizard you can log into, and you can answer some questions about yourself and your situation, and they'll attempt to give you sort of your top prioritized security advice. There's some folks in the political arena who will say, like, if you are, a local politician or something like that, here are the top things you need to do to prevent yourself from, let's say, becoming the next John Podesta, right? So maybe there's ways to customize advice for people in different situations that we should be looking at rather than trying to give everybody the same advice all the time. And then finally, can we use the security mindset for good here? So let's think about our advice and the information and tools that we're using adversarially. How can this information be misused? What's it going to look like when someone actually tries to execute this advice in practice? What's going to happen when they try to do it? So this is, where like Rick's work is a great example of thinking through how do people actually, use what they've learned about phishing sort of in the real world. And these are research questions that we can study. We can think about what happens, in the real world when this advice and these security tools, the rubber meets the road. And a fun example from my work is we found that the old Python documents gave examples for how to encrypt things, and the examples used ECB mode. And for everybody who's not a cryptographer, using ECB mode is basically saying that I would like to do encryption without the encrypting, please. Like, I would like to process the thing through an encryption algorithm that will come back basically being It's not randomized, so it's basically not secure at all. And so here's an API that software developers have to use. What do software developers do? They look at the examples in the documentation. The example is telling you to do exactly the wrong thing, right? Let's look at this adversarially. What's going to happen? So we can think about these things. So just to sum up, there's a lot of bad info out there. There's just a lot of info out there in general, and a lot of it is bad. And fixing it is our job, right? That's kind of what we're here to do. Security experts are the reason why things have gotten this bad to begin with, and we're going to have to unfortunately clean up this mess. And so we have to think harder about how and when to apply the security mindset, how to do some outreach to try to fix these things that currently exist. And we need some more research into not just sort of automation and user-friendly interfaces, but how to measure what advice works and how to better integrate that advice into what people are already doing every day. And I just want to quickly acknowledge many more collaborators than can possibly fit on this slide, but these are just a few of my students, past and present, who've worked on these things, and funding organizations. And yeah, I will leave it there. Thanks, guys.
Amazing. Questions? Are you, when you're gonna go. So obligatory point. It really stood out for me when you mentioned the router. Was it router or router?
Yes.
The router, yes. That stood out for me quite a bit. Like I said, I'm just here to make you laugh. Josiah.
Thanks, Michelle. That was great, as always.
Thanks, Josiah.
Government agencies and companies are notorious for putting out best practice documents, a phrase I personally hate a lot. I'm wondering if you can recommend a different phrase that is more appropriate, sort of given all the things you've talked about.
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't thought about that. Reasonable practices? I like that. I didn't hear who said that, but that was very good. Yeah, or, top priorities maybe, or like, reasonable practice is pretty good. Something that gets at that these things are finite, right? So like short list of practices, maybe something like that. So leading practices.
The common way.
Okay, excellent.
Because they're leading now, right?
Right.
They're not always leading, right? And only so many can lead.
Right, they can't.
It's not a priority, right?
Well, I guess if you ask some experts, all of them can be leading, but hopefully not. Yes. So.
I think right behind you. Yeah.
My question was about the priorities in terms of focusing on the top 3 things that should be priority for you and tailoring it maybe to certain roles at an agency. So someone who works at security might have different top priorities regarding physical security, but someone who's an admin who's mostly in the office, maybe doesn't even leave the office for the whole 8 hours, like their roles and responsibilities are different, right?
Yeah.
We just started expanding to talk about privileged users at our agency, and that list is going to be growing as time goes on, as more devices and things become on the cloud server, and we're all remote. Like their roles are expanding in a way that they don't quite understand is more into cybersecurity because it's all over the network. So, but I think the idea of tailoring it, not to make different points for people, but tailoring it to your role and why it's important will help feed that idea that I thought about you in mind specifically, and here's what you should do. Yeah. That's different than what he should do, but it's all still important to our mission as an agency in keeping us safe.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think it's certainly, if you want to assume that you can't just give everybody a million different things to do, you're going to have to pick a couple. And it's, of course, not reasonable to expect that there would be one, set of the 3 single most important things that would make the most sense for everybody all the time. Some things maybe, might apply broadly, but I think it will make sense. It's part of prioritizing, right, is figuring out what are good priorities for different roles, rather than just kind of, coming from this mindset of we have to prevent every possible problem. And that leads you to, this exploding arena of advice, as opposed to trying to think about like what are the things we're the most worried about for this role, and why, and then then that gives you some idea of what you should be telling people.
Brilliant. Next, yep.
Great talk. So the number of legal cybersecurity imperatives around the world is basically exploding. And your conclusion about there being contradictory and too many and whatnot, I think could also apply to that arena. And so my question is, are you seeing any efforts to validate, cull the list of statutes globally that address cybersecurity or have cybersecurity imperatives in them?
So I have not seen too much of that. When we did this work on the compliance standards, we talked about this a little bit, and we got some pushback that, of course they're outdated because it takes 10 years to issue a new standard, right? And and things of that nature. And so I think this is just a hard problem. It's not obvious how to write these laws in a way that will not sort of quickly become outdated in this fashion, and certainly, dealing with multiple jurisdictions that are trying to do different things. But I think that's maybe, connects back to some of the outreach stuff that it's kind of up to us to, right? The lawyers probably didn't come up with these, or the politicians probably didn't come up with these sets of mandates by themselves, right? They had some technologists or some security experts help them write down what these policies should look like. And so it's a little bit up to us to do a better job of communicating, what are the actually important things in a way to try to, communicating that just adding more things to the list is in the end not helpful, in the same way that, probably not all government agencies are as flexible as NIST is, but in the way that, NIST was able to, pivot on the authentication stuff and actually, improve the rules, right?
Yeah, just in the last year, we actually implemented it in our agency. At NIST, they just implemented the new guidance within the
All
last
right, well,
year.
you're giving
We
me
still
hope.
were changing our passwords every 90 days.
You're giving me hope that maybe the university is going to get there eventually also, right? So I think these are hard problems, but it helps to sort of, maybe it helps, I don't know, I hope that it helps to keep in mind that there is this ratchet effect that just says more is always better. And I think it helps at least a little bit to keep in mind that actually sometimes more is worse, and that it's really important to push back on these things.
Hello, my name is Lorenzo. I really appreciate your advice work as well. And you mentioned advice prioritization, and then you mentioned finding advice that's outdated or advice that could be revised. And then my question is, outside of, I think, things you mentioned earlier, like the content of the advice, it seems that there's a ton of advice out there. So it's not to say there's maybe good or bad advice, but I guess your opinion, what would you say are things that is reflective of, I guess, good or bad advice, or things that could be improved on when it comes to, I guess, bad bad advice?
Yeah, so I think, like you said, some of it is just outdated, and so some of it comes from not revisiting these things often enough, right? Things that were really important, but just aren't anymore because the technology has improved or things have gotten better. And some of it is, I think, comes from nobody really knows what to do, but they feel like they have to do something, so they come up with something to tell you, right? Or they comes from these misunderstandings like, longer passwords are better, so we're going to tell people to make passphrases. Okay, but how can you think up a phrase? Oh, well, I can remember the lyric from a favorite song, right? So I'm just going to tell people to do that, right? So it comes from this place of we have to come up with something, so what are we going to put there, I think. So some part of it is, having better processes for revisiting these things rather than just kind of repeating what's in the annual training every single year, and also, making more connections, bridging, different parts of the research community, practitioners, people from different places to inform, to better inform this stuff, the people who are designing this information.
Great. I know that Michelle needs to dash, so I just want to say thanks once again, and let's tell her thank you.
And I almost forgot, my group does also do a lot of work with information professionals. We do stuff on secure software development and sysadmins and security operations, and always love to have new partners and groups to do research with. So please drop me a note if you're interested in any of those things.
Perfect.
Thanks.
This evening.